where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
You know what nobody tells you about being invisible? It's not the worst thing that can happen to you. The worst thing is when you finally get seen. Really, truly seen. And your first instinct is to hide. Because after years of being overlooked, dismissed, treated like furniture that occasionally needs dusting, you've built an entire identity around not mattering. And when someone comes along and shatters that identity by insisting you do matter, by choosing you over everyone else, by making your invisibility impossible to maintain, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like terror. This is the secret nobody shares about transformation. Sometimes the thing you've wanted most is the thing that scares you the most when it finally arrives. And that paradox, that beautiful, devastating contradiction, is exactly where Eleanor Hamilton found herself in 1815 London, when the most desired man in England dropped to one knee in front of everyone who'd ever called her a poor spinster aunt, and asked her to be his wife. Here's the thing that's going to sound controversial, maybe even offensive, but I need you to hear it. Society doesn't accidentally overlook certain people. It's not a mistake when you're invisible. It's a choice, their choice, based on codes and rules about who deserves attention and who doesn't, who matters and who's expendable, who gets the fairy tale, and who gets to watch from the sidelines while pretending they're fine with it. Eleanor was 38, unmarried, plain by society's cruel standards, and she'd been relegated to the role of convenient relative, the woman you bring along to chaperone, the aunt who helps with arrangements, the body that fills space at family gatherings but doesn't actually participate in the life happening around her. And here's the mystery that'll make you uncomfortable. She'd accepted it. She'd made peace with being nobody, because fighting against invisibility, when everyone's agreed you don't matter, is exhausting work that rarely succeeds. Until the night everything changed. Until the Duke of Ashford saw her crying on a terrace and did something nobody had done in years. He asked if she was okay. Not because he wanted something, not because it was polite, but because he genuinely saw her distress and cared about it. Now, I'm going to make a bold claim that might contradict everything you've been taught about love and relationships and what makes people valuable. The things that make you unmarketable in the eyes of most people might be exactly what makes you irresistible to the right person. Eleanor's age, her plainness, her complete absence of social performance skills, her inability to flirt or manipulate or play the games everyone else was playing, all the things that made her invisible to 99% of people made her fascinating to the one person whose opinion actually mattered. Because while every other woman at that ball was competing, calculating, performing a carefully rehearsed version of desirability, Eleanor had given up. She wasn't trying to be anything because she'd accepted she'd never be enough. And that surrender to authenticity, that exhausted honesty, that complete lack of pretense. It was like water in a desert, to a man drowning in fakeness. This is the hidden truth they don't teach you. Sometimes you don't find love by becoming more. Sometimes you find it by finally stopping the exhausting work of trying to be anything other than exactly what you are. But here's where this story gets really interesting, where the enigma deepens and the plot thickens in ways you won't expect. This isn't just a story about a spinster getting her fairy tale ending, though that happens. And trust me, the moment when she says yes in front of everyone who dismissed her is absolutely delicious. This is about what happens after, about the disappearance of your old identity when a new one gets thrust upon you, about why we sabotage good things because we can't believe we deserve them, about the conflict between wanting to be seen and being terrified of what people will see when they finally look. About why society punishes people who refuse to stay in their assigned boxes, even when, especially when, they're rising rather than falling. Eleanor's story is a revelation wrapped in a conspiracy, a fairy tale that's actually a mirror reflecting all the ways we've been taught to diminish ourselves, to accept less, to believe that wanting more is somehow forbidden for people like us. So here's my promise to you. Over the next however many minutes you spend with me, I'm going to share Eleanor's story in a way that'll make you think differently about invisibility, about worth, about the silence we're taught to maintain about our own desires. You're going to see yourself in her struggles, recognize your own patterns in her doubts, maybe even cry a little when she finally gets her moment of vindication. But more than that, you're going to walk away with something practical, something actionable, something you can use today to start dismantling the invisible prison you've been living in without even realizing it was there. Because here's the final truth I need you to understand before we dive deep. Eleanor's story isn't special because she's special. It's special because she's ordinary. She's you. She's me. She's every person who's ever felt like they don't quite fit, like they're too much or not enough, like they're watching life happen to other people while sitting in the cheap seats of their own existence. And if Eleanor can go from poor spinster aunt to duchess, not through magic or luck or some external transformation, but through the simple, terrifying act of being genuinely herself, then what's your excuse? What trace of possibility might be hiding in your own story, waiting for you to finally stop performing and start living? London, 1815. Eleanor's 38 years weighed on her shoulders like an invisible cloak she never asked to wear. In the grand drawing rooms of Mayfair, she'd become what polite society called a case lost to time. That careful phrase they used when they meant you'd missed your chance at maturity's greatest prize. Her role? Companion to her nieces, the beautiful Hamilton girls who glittered like diamonds while she faded into the wallpaper. "Don't worry about what Eleanor wears," her sister Margaret would say with that practiced smile. "Nobody's going to notice her anyway." The words weren't meant to cut, which somehow made them slice deeper. It's funny how cruelty wrapped in casualness leaves the darkest traces on your soul, isn't it? Eleanor had learned to swallow these comments like bitter medicine, her face a mask of pleasant indifference, while something inside her withered a little more each day. The enigma of her existence had become this: how do you remain visible when everyone's decided you're not worth seeing? I know exactly how Eleanor felt, because I've been there too, standing in a crowded room feeling like a ghost nobody bothered to acknowledge. There was this party once where I watched people's eyes slide right past me like I was furniture, their conversations flowing around me as if I didn't exist. You know that moment when someone looks directly at you but doesn't really see you? When they're already scanning for someone more interesting, more valuable, more worthy of their attention? That's not just loneliness. That's a special kind of silence that screams in your ears. I remember forcing myself to smile, to nod, to pretend I didn't notice being the only person without someone to talk to, the invisible friend at the gathering, the odd cousin at family dinners, the colleague people forget to include in lunch plans. We've all got our version of this story, don't we? And here's the secret nobody tells you. After enough time being unseen, you start to believe you deserve it. Being invisible isn't just about romance or marriage prospects, though society loves to reduce women to that single measure of success. It's about something far more fundamental: your value as a human being. Eleanor wasn't just unmarried. She was reduced to a function, a role, a utility. Aunt Eleanor will chaperone. Aunt Eleanor will handle the arrangements. Aunt Eleanor doesn't mind staying home. She'd become the family's unpaid servant, and the real conspiracy was that everyone pretended this was normal, natural, generous even. "At least she's useful," they'd whisper, as if being useful was the consolation prize for being unwanted. The cruelest part? She'd grown so accustomed to rejection that it barely registered anymore. Oh, it still hurt, don't get me wrong, but it was like a chronic ache you learn to walk with. A weight you carry so long you forget what lightness feels like. Resignation becomes your armor, your shield, your survival strategy when hope feels too dangerous to hold on to. Here's an analogy that might hit home. Being invisible is like wearing a magic cloak you never asked for and can't take off. People look straight through you, having entire conversations about your life, as if you're not standing right there. They make plans, decisions, assumptions, all without consulting the person it actually affects. "Eleanor won't mind," they say. "Eleanor understands." Eleanor's just happy to be included. And the twisted part? You're expected to smile, to be grateful, to never complain about being treated like a piece of hidden furniture that occasionally needs dusting. You become complicit in your own erasure because causing a conflict means losing even the scraps of belonging you've managed to scrape together. So you laugh at jokes made at your expense. You agree when they call you poor Eleanor. You participate in the theater of your own diminishment because what's the alternative? Admitting how much it destroys you inside? Let me ask you something, and be honest with yourself. Raise that mental hand if any of this sounds familiar. Have you ever been conveniently cropped out of family photos, left standing at the edge while everyone else squeezed together? Have you fielded those helpful questions? Still haven't found anyone? Don't you want to settle down? Aren't you worried about being alone? Delivered with that particular blend of pity and judgment that makes you want to scream? Maybe you've smiled through comparisons with siblings, cousins, colleagues who somehow got everything right, while you got everything forbidden wrong. Perhaps you've perfected the art of laughing at your own expense before anyone else can, beating them to the punch like it'll hurt less if you're the one throwing it. The disappearance of your needs, your feelings, your entire existence becomes so normalized, you stop fighting it. You tell yourself it doesn't matter, that you're fine, that you've made peace with your place in the world's hierarchy of worthy and worthless. But here's what I've learned through my own painful journey through invisibility. That peace is fake. It's not acceptance. It's exhaustion. It's not maturity. It's surrender. Eleanor spent years perfecting this performance, becoming an expert at swallowing her hurt and presenting a pleasant, undemanding version of herself to the world. She'd mastered the codes of social survival for the unwanted. Never ask for too much. Never expect too much. Never be too much. The revelation she hadn't yet reached was that all this accommodating, all this shrinking, all this careful management of everyone else's comfort was killing her spirit molecule by molecule. She was dying by 1,000 tiny erasures, and nobody noticed. Not because they were cruel, necessarily, but because she'd become so good at making her pain invisible too. Isn't that the ultimate mystery of human existence? How we can be surrounded by people and still be utterly, devastatingly alone? The night of the Ashford Ball, Eleanor had reached a breaking point she didn't even recognize as breaking. She'd accompanied her nieces, Cecilia and Arabella, 17 and 19 respectively, perfect little confections of youth and beauty, to what everyone called the event of the season. The Duke of Ashford was newly returned from the continent, unmarried, wealthy beyond measure, and according to breathless reports, devastatingly handsome. Every unmarried woman in London had set their cap at him, and Eleanor's nieces were no exception. She'd help them dress, listen to their excited chatter, arrange their hair just so, and then taken her assigned position. The row of chairs along the wall where society parked its inconvenient relatives, the elderly, the infirm, the lost causes, like herself. From there, she watched her nieces flutter and preen, watched the beautiful people dance and laugh, watched life happen to everyone but her. And the worst part? Her own nieces talked about her as if she wasn't sitting 3 feet away. Poor Aunt Eleanor, Cecilia had giggled to a friend, her voice carrying perfectly. Can you imagine being that age and never? She'd trailed off into meaningful silence that said everything. Arabella had added with performative sympathy. At least she's useful for something. They weren't being malicious. That's what made it cut so deep. They genuinely saw nothing wrong with these observations, the way you might comment on a worn-out piece of furniture that's past its prime but still serves a purpose. Eleanor sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully neutral, feeling something inside her crack. Not break. That would be too clean, too final. Just crack, like porcelain developing a fault line that promises eventual shattering. When the opportunity came to escape to the terrace, to slip away into the cool night air where nobody would miss her, nobody would notice her absence. She took it like a drowning woman reaching for air. But she didn't know yet that everything was about to change, that her carefully constructed acceptance of invisibility was about to collide with something she never expected, being truly, devastatingly seen. The terrace was blessedly empty, and Eleanor let herself breathe for the first time all evening. Behind her, the ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, laughter spilling through the French doors like a taunt. Out here, in the shadows, she could drop the mask, that pleasant, undemanding expression she'd worn so long it had nearly become permanent. Her hands gripped the cold stone balustrade, and she let herself feel it. The crushing weight of being nobody to everyone, the secret shame of mattering so little that her absence wouldn't even register. Inside, her nieces were probably already dancing, their youth and beauty opening doors that had slammed shut for Eleanor decades ago. The enigma that haunted her wasn't why she'd been passed over. Society had made that abundantly clear. But why she'd kept showing up, kept pretending, kept participating in her own erasure. What was the point of attending balls where you'd never dance, of dressing carefully for eyes that would never see you, of existing in spaces that treated your presence like an inconvenient trace of something better left forgotten? Let me tell you about the day I almost quit showing up entirely, because I think you'll understand what Eleanor was feeling. I was at this work event, one of those networking things where everyone's supposed to mingle and make connections, and I spent 3 hours watching people's eyes glaze over mid-conversation with me, watching them spot someone more important over my shoulder, watching them make their excuses and drift away. I wasn't rude, wasn't boring, wasn't doing anything wrong except being unremarkable, forgettable, invisible. There's this specific flavor of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who don't see you, you know? It's worse than being alone in an empty room because at least then you can blame the absence of company. But when you're drowning in a sea of people and nobody throws you a line, that's when you start questioning whether the problem is the world or if it's just you. I remember standing in that corner, watching everyone else connect and laugh and belong, and thinking, what's the point? Why am I even here? Here's what nobody tells you about invisibility. There comes a moment when you have to decide. Keep performing the role they've assigned you. The wallflower, the spinster, the convenient helper. or admit the truth that's been screaming in the silence of your heart. Eleanor had reached that crossroads on the terrace, though she didn't recognize it yet. She could go back inside, take her seat among the other discarded souls, smile through another evening of being overlooked. Or she could acknowledge what was really happening. She was watching life instead of living it, observing the movie where she should have been the protagonist but got cast as background furniture nobody remembers. That's the real conspiracy of invisibility, how it trains you to be complicit, to accept the scraps, to be grateful for being tolerated, rather than demanded to be truly seen. The codes of survival for the unwanted all point to the same lesson: don't make waves, don't ask for more, don't expect anything different, because expecting is how you get hurt. But something shifts when you stop pretending, doesn't it? When you finally let yourself feel the full weight of your loneliness, instead of managing it, packaging it, hiding it away where it won't inconvenience anyone. Eleanor stood there in the darkness, letting tears she'd held back for years finally fall, and it felt like relief. Horrible, crushing, devastating relief. Because at least it was real. At least she wasn't performing. Strength she didn't feel, or happiness she didn't possess. The conflict between what we show the world and what we actually feel creates this internal pressure that builds and builds until something has to give. And when it finally does, when you stop holding it together, there's this strange moment of clarity. It hurts like hell, but it's honest pain, not the dull ache of suppressed truth. Eleanor thought she was having a breakdown, but maybe she was actually having a breakthrough, finally admitting that acceptance of invisibility isn't peace. It's surrender to a slow death of the spirit. It was precisely in that moment of "I give up" that everything changed. Eleanor heard footsteps behind her, and her heart sank. Someone coming to fetch her back to her designated chair, no doubt, or worse, one of her nieces coming to complain about something trivial. She wiped her tears quickly, preparing to slide the mask back on, to become pleasant Aunt Eleanor again. But when she turned, she found herself face to face with the Duke of Ashford himself. And the expression on his face wasn't what she expected. Not pity, not disgust, not the careful blankness people wore when confronted with someone crying. He looked tired, real, human. "Forgive the intrusion," he said quietly. But I couldn't endure another moment in there either. And just like that, the hidden truth revealed itself. She wasn't the only one performing, wasn't the only one suffocating under the weight of expectations and roles and the endless theater of social acceptance. The mystery of genuine connection is that it often happens not when we're at our best, but when we're at our most honestly broken. Here's the secret nobody shares about meaningful relationships. They don't start in the spotlight, in the carefully orchestrated moments of social performance. They start in the shadows, in the quiet spaces where people finally drop their masks because they're too exhausted to hold them up anymore. Eleanor wasn't trying to impress the Duke. She'd given up on impressing anyone. She wasn't performing charm or wit or any of the social graces that usually govern these interactions. She was just herself. Sad, tired, done with pretending. And somehow, impossibly, that's what made him stay. While every other woman in that ballroom was competing for his attention with rehearsed smiles and calculated conversations, Eleanor offered him something infinitely more valuable: the permission to be real, too. "I suppose you think me pathetic," she said, not even caring anymore what he thought. "On the contrary," he replied, "I think you're the first honest person I've encountered all evening." That revelation, that authenticity might be more magnetic than beauty, more compelling than performance, hadn't occurred to Eleanor before because nobody had ever valued it in her. The Duke, Sebastian was his name, though she hadn't dared think of him so informally before, didn't return to the ball immediately. Instead, he leaned against the balustrade beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. "You're Miss Eleanor Hamilton," he said, and she was shocked that he knew her name, that he'd noticed her at all among the sea of more noticeable women. "I've watched you this evening, managing your nieces, ensuring everyone else's comfort while entirely neglecting your own." She didn't know what to say to that, this unexpected acknowledgement of her existence, her efforts, her carefully hidden exhaustion. He continued, his voice carrying its own weight of weariness. "I'm expected to choose a wife from that collection of performing peacocks inside. Every word they speak is rehearsed, every smile calculated, every gesture designed to please. It's exhausting, being the prize everyone's competing for. Nobody sees me. They see the title, the fortune, the opportunity." And Eleanor understood, in that moment of shared disappearance, that invisibility came in many forms. Sometimes you're overlooked. Sometimes you're seen so intensely that the real you vanishes entirely beneath expectations. They talked for an hour on that terrace. Two people who'd been playing roles for so long they'd almost forgotten who they actually were beneath the performance. Sebastian told her about the pressure of being the most eligible bachelor, how every interaction felt like a business transaction, how lonely it was to be wanted for everything except yourself. Eleanor found herself sharing things she'd never voiced: the pain of being considered lost, the humiliation of being pitied, the slow erosion of self-worth that comes from years of being nobody's choice. And here's what happened. They saw each other. Really saw. Not the Duke and the spinster, not the prize and the failure, but Sebastian and Eleanor. Two humans tired of performing, desperate for something real. When he finally said, "I should let you return before you're missed," there was irony in his smile that matched hers, because they both knew she wouldn't be missed. But as she turned to leave, he caught her hand gently. "Miss Hamilton," he said, his voice carrying a code she couldn't quite decipher, "would you permit me to call on you tomorrow?" And Eleanor's world, which had seemed so fixed and finished just hours before, suddenly cracked open to reveal possibilities she'd thought were forbidden to someone like her. But she didn't trust it yet. How could she? What happened on that terrace wasn't magic, though it felt like it to Eleanor. It was something far more powerful: the collision of two people who'd stopped performing at exactly the same moment. Inside the ballroom, every unmarried woman was a product on display, carefully packaged and marketed to catch a duke's eye. Perfect posture, rehearsed laughter, practiced glances that were sultry but not too forward, interested but not desperate. They were all reading from the same script, following the same codes of courtship that had been passed down through generations. But here's the secret that nobody tells you. When everyone's selling the same thing, nothing stands out. Eleanor wasn't selling anything because she'd long ago accepted that nobody was buying. And ironically, devastatingly, beautifully, that's exactly what made her invaluable. She was the only genuine article in a room full of carefully constructed illusions, the only person who wasn't trying to be anything other than exactly what she was. Even her sadness was honest, and in a world of performed happiness, that honesty was magnetic. Let me tell you about the time I learned this lesson the hard way, because I think it'll resonate. I spent months trying to be the person I thought someone wanted me to be, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, pretending to love things I didn't care about, editing every word before I spoke to make sure it was the right thing to say. I was so busy performing, that I forgot who I actually was beneath the costume. And you know what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The connection I was desperately trying to manufacture never materialized because nobody was connecting with me. They were connecting with a character I was playing, and I was exhausted from the performance. It wasn't until I finally said, "Forget this," and just showed up as my messy, imperfect, occasionally weird self that something shifted. The hidden truth revealed itself. People who like your performance aren't your people. Your people are the ones who like you when the show's over, when the mask comes off, when you're just you, even if you is complicated and contradictory and sometimes really hard to love. Sebastian had spent weeks being pursued by London's finest. Women like Vivienne Ashworth, who was objectively stunning with her golden hair and porcelain skin, her practiced grace and calculated charm. She knew exactly what to say, exactly how to laugh, exactly when to touch his arm with feigned casualness. Every interaction with her was perfectly choreographed, a dance she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. But here's the enigma Sebastian couldn't solve. Why did perfection feel so empty? Why did her company leave him feeling more alone than if he'd been by himself? Because Vivienne wasn't interested in Sebastian the man. She was interested in the Duke, the title, the access to power and wealth and status. She was investing in real estate, not building a relationship. Eleanor, on the other hand, didn't want anything from him. Couldn't want anything from him, given that she'd long ago accepted she wasn't entitled to want. So when she spoke to him, it was without agenda, without calculation, without the constant internal math of, is this increasing my chances? That absence of strategy was its own kind of revelation. A glimpse of what connection could feel like when it wasn't a transaction. Here's the brutal analogy that captures this perfectly. Everyone at the ball was playing poker, holding their cards close, bluffing and strategizing, and trying to read everyone else's hand. Eleanor wasn't playing at all. She'd already folded, already left the table. And paradoxically, that made her the most interesting person in the room to someone tired of games. When Sebastian asked about her life, she didn't give him the polished version designed to impress. She told him the truth, that she felt invisible, that she struggled with her place in the world, that some days she wondered what the point of any of it was. Can you imagine? Admitting darkness to the man everyone else was trying to dazzle with light. But that vulnerability, that raw honesty, created an immediate conflict with everything else he'd experienced that evening. It was like tasting real food after years of artificial sweetener. Once you know what authentic tastes like, the fake stuff becomes unbearable. Eleanor didn't realize it, but her refusal to hide her pain, her inability to pretend everything was fine, made her the most trustworthy person he'd met in months. The Duke said something that night that changed everything. "I don't have to pretend with you." When was the last time someone said that to you? When was the last time you could say it to someone else? Think about it. Really, think about it. How many of your relationships are built on carefully managed versions of yourself, on showing only the acceptable parts while hiding away everything that might be too much, too weird, too broken, too real? We're all walking around in these elaborate costumes of normalcy, terrified that if someone sees who we really are beneath the performance, they'll run. But here's the mystery that Eleanor stumbled into accidentally. The people worth having in your life are the ones who stay when the costume comes off. The ones who see your mess and don't flinch. The ones who witness your darkness and don't try to immediately fix it or flee from it. Those are your people. Everyone else is just an audience member who will forget you the moment the show ends. Now, let me get practical for a second, because this isn't just philosophy. This is actionable wisdom you can use today. Ask yourself this question. If you could attract someone, a friend, a partner, whoever, by being 100% yourself, complete with your quirks and fears and failures and weird habits, would you want that person in your life? Because here's the thing, that's the only person worth having. Anyone who needs you to be someone else isn't actually choosing you. They're choosing their fantasy of who they think you should be. And maintaining that fantasy is exhausting work that will eventually destroy you from the inside out. Eleanor had spent years contorting herself to fit into boxes other people built, trying to be useful enough, quiet enough, grateful enough to earn her place in spaces that barely tolerated her. But with Sebastian, she couldn't sustain the performance because she'd already given up. And that surrender to authenticity was what saved her, not her beauty. She wasn't beautiful by society's standards, not her accomplishments. She had none that mattered in their world. Just her realness, her willingness to be seen in all her imperfect, struggling, genuinely human glory. The contrast between Eleanor and Viviane became stark in Sebastian's mind over the following days. Viviane represented everything he was supposed to want: beauty, poise, social grace, the ability to navigate any situation with practiced ease. She would be a perfect duchess, hostessing flawless dinner parties and saying all the right things to all the right people. But would she ever tell him when she was scared? Would she ever admit when something hurt? Would he ever actually know her? Or would he spend his life married to a performance? Eleanor was the opposite of every secret fantasy he'd been taught to have. She was older, plain, socially awkward, without fortune or connections. But when she looked at him, she saw him. Not his title, not his wealth, not what he could do for her. Just him. And the forbidden truth that high society would never admit was this: being truly seen is more intoxicating than being desired. Being known is more satisfying than being worshipped. Being chosen for who you are is more valuable than being selected for what you represent. That's the kind of love that lasts, that sustains, that doesn't shatter the moment reality intrudes on the fantasy. Here's my challenge to you, and I want you to really sit with this. What would change in your life if you stopped trying to be acceptable and started being authentic? What relationships would you lose? Probably some, the ones built on false foundations anyway. But what might you gain? Connection that feels real instead of performed. Rest instead of constant exhaustion from maintaining the act. The freedom to be wrong, to be messy, to be human instead of perfect. Eleanor didn't choose authenticity as a strategy. She fell into it through desperation and exhaustion. But you don't have to wait until you're broken to start being real. You can choose it now, today, this moment. You can decide that the disappearance of your true self is too high a price to pay for acceptance from people who never really knew you anyway. The trace of falseness you leave behind won't be mourned. But the emergence of your genuine self might just attract the kind of connections that change everything. And maybe, just maybe, you'll discover what Eleanor was about to learn. That the right person doesn't need you to be perfect. They just need you to be real. But would she trust it when it became undeniable? Sebastian did exactly what he promised. He called on Eleanor the very next afternoon, arriving at the Hamilton residence with flowers and a formality that sent the entire household into shocked confusion. Eleanor's sister Margaret nearly fainted when the butler announced His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, while Eleanor sat in the drawing room mending one of Cecilia's dresses. The look on Margaret's face was priceless. A mixture of disbelief, calculation, and barely concealed panic as she tried to understand why the most eligible man in England was asking for her spinster sister instead of her beautiful daughters. But Eleanor? Eleanor's first thought wasn't joy or excitement. It was suspicion. Deep, bone-level suspicion that screamed, "This is a mistake," or "This is a joke," or "He's confused me with someone else." That's what years of rejection do to you. They train you to distrust good fortune, to look for the hidden catch, to protect yourself by expecting the worst before hope can take root and hurt you when it inevitably gets crushed. I have a confession to make, and maybe you'll see yourself in this too. When something genuinely good happens to me, my first instinct isn't gratitude. It's paranoia. Where's the catch? What's the trick? Who's about to pull the rug out? I got a job offer once that was genuinely perfect. Good pay, interesting work, kind people. And instead of celebrating, I spent 2 weeks convinced there was something wrong with it that I wasn't seeing. I researched the company obsessively, looked for red flags, even considered turning it down, because things like this don't happen to people like me. And you know what? I almost talked myself out of it. I nearly rejected something wonderful because I'd been trained by past disappointments to expect disappointment, to guard against hope like it was a disease that would infect and destroy me. The secret nobody tells you about trauma, and yes, repeated rejection is trauma, is that it doesn't just hurt you in the moment. It rewires your brain to anticipate pain, to see danger in opportunity, to choose familiar suffering over uncertain joy, because at least suffering is predictable. When Sebastian took Eleanor's hand and said, "Miss Hamilton, I find myself unable to stop thinking about our conversation last evening. I wonder if you might permit me to know you better." She literally looked behind her to see who he was really talking to. I'm not exaggerating. That's what happened. She thought he meant one of her nieces, who must have entered the room. When she realized he meant her, actually, her, Eleanor's mind went into overdrive with 1,000 variations of "why me?" Why would he choose the plain aunt over the beautiful nieces? Why would he pursue the woman society had labeled a lost cause? What was wrong with him that he couldn't see what everyone else saw so clearly, that she wasn't worth choosing? The enigma she couldn't solve was how someone like him could genuinely want someone like her, and that inability to solve it made her certain the whole thing was somehow forbidden, somehow wrong, somehow destined to end in humiliation. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? How we can be handed exactly what we've always wanted, and still find ways to convince ourselves we don't deserve it, that it can't be real, that accepting it will only lead to worse pain later. Here's the psychology behind this that nobody explains properly. When you spend years building a narrative about yourself, "I'm not attractive enough," "I'm too old," "I'm not interesting," that narrative becomes your identity. It becomes the lens through which you interpret every experience, every interaction, every possibility. And when something happens that contradicts that narrative, your brain freaks out. Because if the story you've been telling yourself about who you are is wrong, then what else is wrong? If you're not actually the worthless, invisible, unwanted person you thought you were, then you've been suffering unnecessarily. You've been limiting yourself for no reason. You've been accepting crumbs when you deserved the whole feast. That revelation is too destabilizing, too painful to accept all at once. So your brain does something insidious. It finds ways to reject the new information, to maintain the old story, to keep you safe inside the familiar prison of low expectations. Eleanor couldn't simply accept Sebastian's interest, because accepting it would mean acknowledging that she'd wasted years accepting invisibility she never deserved. That's a hard pill to swallow. The conflict intensified when Sebastian began visiting regularly, bringing books he thought she'd enjoy, engaging her in conversations about philosophy and politics that nobody had ever bothered to have with her before. He treated her like her thoughts mattered, like her opinions were valuable, like she was someone worth knowing and not just someone to be tolerated. And with each visit, Eleanor's internal war escalated. Part of her wanted to believe it, wanted to accept that maybe, impossibly, someone genuinely saw value in her. But the louder part, the part shaped by decades of rejection, kept whispering poison. He's playing a game. He feels sorry for you. He'll realize his mistake soon. Don't get comfortable. This will end badly. You're being foolish. These thoughts weren't just pessimism. They were armor, protection against the devastating disappointment she was certain was coming. Because here's the mystery of self-protection. Sometimes we hurt ourselves preemptively to avoid being hurt by others, and we call it wisdom when it's really just fear wearing a clever disguise. Let me ask you something that might sting a little. How many times have you sabotaged something good because you couldn't believe it was real? How many opportunities have you let slip through your fingers because it wasn't for you, or you'd just mess it up anyway, or good things don't happen to people like me? I'm talking about jobs you didn't apply for, relationships you pushed away, dreams you abandoned before even trying because failure seemed inevitable, and at least if you quit first, you controlled the narrative of why it didn't work out. That's what Eleanor was doing. She was preparing her exit strategy before she'd even fully entered the relationship, building escape routes and safety nets because surely, this couldn't last. And the tragic irony? That self-protective doubt, that inability to trust good fortune, that constant waiting for the other shoe to drop, it can become the very thing that destroys what you're trying to protect yourself from losing. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Expect the worst, and you'll often create it, not because you're psychic, but because you can't stop sabotaging the good stuff with your fear. Margaret, Eleanor's sister, certainly didn't help matters. She pulled Eleanor aside one afternoon and said with saccharine concern, "Dear, I worry you're reading too much into the Duke's politeness. Men of his station often amuse themselves with unusual friendships. I'd hate to see you embarrassed when he inevitably moves on to someone more suitable." Notice the codes in that statement? It was designed to sound caring while actually being devastating. Margaret, Eleanor's sister, certainly didn't help matters. She pulled Eleanor aside one afternoon and said, with saccharine concern, "Dear, I worry you're reading too much into the Duke's politeness. Men of his station often amuse themselves with unusual friendships. I'd hate to see you embarrassed when he inevitably moves on to someone more suitable." Notice the codes in that statement? It was designed to sound caring while actually being devastating. Someone more suitable meant younger, prettier, more valuable. Margaret was supposedly protecting Eleanor from disappointment, but what she was really doing was reinforcing every negative belief Eleanor had about herself, every bit of internalized unworthiness that whispered she wasn't enough. And here's the hidden truth about people who worry about you getting your hopes up. Often they're more comfortable with you staying small, staying in your assigned box, staying beneath them in the hierarchy of worth. Your elevation threatens their sense of order, their understanding of how the world works, their own position relative to yours. If you can rise, what's their excuse for staying stuck? Sebastian sensed Eleanor's doubt even when she tried to hide it, saw the way she flinched when he complimented her, noticed how she deflected every kind word like it was an attack she needed to defend against. One afternoon, frustrated by her persistent disbelief, he asked her directly, "Eleanor, why is it so impossible for you to accept that I might genuinely admire you?" and she gave him the most honest answer she had. Because I've spent 38 years learning that I'm not the woman men admire. Every lesson life has taught me says this isn't real, can't be real, shouldn't be real. And when it ends, because it will end, I'll be exactly where I was before, except now I'll know what I'm missing. Isn't it kinder to never taste water when you're dying of thirst than to have one sip before the desert claims you again? Can you feel the disappearance of hope in those words, the way years of rejection had convinced her that wanting was more dangerous than despair? But Sebastian looked at her with such intensity and said something that shattered her carefully constructed defenses. I'm not being kind, Eleanor. I'm being selfish. You're the first person in years who makes me feel like myself instead of a title. I need you more than you apparently need me. And that shift in perspective, that maybe he was choosing her not despite her ordinariness, but because of her authenticity, planted a tiny trace of possibility she couldn't quite extinguish, no matter how hard her fear tried. Everything exploded at the Weatherby Ball 3 weeks later, in a moment that would be gossiped about in London drawing rooms for years to come. Eleanor had reluctantly agreed to attend. Sebastian had asked her specifically, which sent Margaret into a frenzy of speculation and the nieces into barely concealed resentment. The evening started like most did, with Eleanor taking her usual position among the wallflowers while Cecilia and Arabella preened and postured for attention. But this time, something was different. This time, Sebastian entered the ballroom, scanned the crowd with barely concealed impatience, and walked directly past every beautiful young woman vying for his notice. He walked straight to Eleanor. The silence that fell over the room was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop as London's most eligible bachelor bowed before the woman they'd all dismissed as invisible. The secret glances, the shocked whispers, the frantic recalculation happening behind 100 pairs of eyes. It was like watching an entire social order realize it had misread the codes completely. But Sebastian wasn't finished. Oh no, he was just getting started. In front of everyone, he extended his hand to Eleanor and said, loud enough for the nearest groups to hear, "Miss Hamilton, would you do me the honor of this dance?" Eleanor's face went pale. She hadn't danced in over a decade. She'd forgotten how, honestly, and the thought of stumbling around the floor while everyone watched was terrifying. But the look in Sebastian's eyes wasn't asking. It was insisting, promising, declaring something she didn't yet understand. So she took his hand, feeling it warm and steady around hers, and let him lead her onto the floor. And as they began to move, Eleanor clumsy at first, then finding her rhythm, she became aware of something extraordinary happening around them. The other dancers were stopping. One by one, couples ceased their movement to watch this impossible pairing. The Duke and the spinster, the prize, and the woman everyone had declared lost. The enigma of it was too fascinating to ignore, too contrary to everything society believed to simply dismiss. They danced 3 dances in a row, which was practically a declaration of serious intent by the standards of the time. By the 3rd dance, Eleanor could feel the weight of 100 stares, could sense the calculations and conspiracy theories multiplying with each turn around the floor. Vivian Ashworth looked like she'd swallowed glass, her perfect composure cracking to reveal fury beneath. Margaret appeared faint, torn between vicarious pride and genuine confusion about how this could possibly be happening. And the nieces, oh, Cecilia and Arabella, looked absolutely stricken, their world visibly tilting as the aunt they'd pitied and patronized suddenly became the object of the Duke's very public attention. But none of that mattered, because Sebastian was looking at Eleanor like she was the only person in the room. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor felt what it was like to be chosen, not settled for, not tolerated, chosen, deliberately, publicly, undeniably chosen. After the third dance, Sebastian didn't return Eleanor to her seat. Instead, he kept her hand in his and led her to the center of the ballroom, to the spot where everyone could see them clearly. Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she thought she might faint. What was he doing? This was too public, too visible, too everything she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. She tried to pull away, to retreat to safety, but Sebastian held firm. And then, impossibly, devastatingly, beautifully, he dropped to one knee. The collective gasp that went up from the assembled crowd was like a physical force. Time seemed to stop. The musicians fell silent, mid-note. Every eye in the room fixed on this impossible tableau. The Duke of Ashford, on his knee before Eleanor Hamilton, the woman they'd all dismissed as nobody. The hidden truth was about to become undeniable public revelation. And Eleanor's mind went completely blank, with shock and terror, and something that might have been joy if she could trust it. "Miss Eleanor Hamilton," Sebastian said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom with absolute clarity, "you are the most genuine, intelligent, courageous woman I have ever known. You see me, truly see me, in a way no one else does. You make me laugh. You challenge my thinking. You make me want to be better than I am. I have spent my entire adult life being pursued for my title and my fortune, but you are the only woman who has ever made me wish I were a better man simply for the privilege of deserving you. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The words hung in the air like a spell, each syllable a hammer blow against everything Eleanor had believed about herself, about her worth, about what was possible for someone like her. She stood there, frozen, unable to process what was happening, unable to reconcile this moment with the narrative she'd carried for 38 years about being unwanted, unworthy, invisible. Imagine the scene. Really picture it for a moment. The silence so complete you could hear the candles flickering in their sconces, the rustle of silk as people leaned forward, desperate not to miss a single second of this impossible drama. The glint of candlelight reflecting off Eleanor's tears, because yes, she was crying now, unable to stop the emotion from pouring out after years of keeping it locked away. And the faces? Oh God, the faces around them were a study in human emotion laid bare. Shock, disbelief, envy, fury, confusion. Cecilia looked like she might be sick. Arabella's mouth hung open in a most unladylike fashion. Margaret was gripping her fan so tightly it was bending. And Vivienne, beautiful, perfect, confident Vivienne, had tears of rage running down her carefully powdered cheeks, destroying her makeup and her composure in equal measure. This wasn't just a proposal. This was a complete overturning of the social order, a repudiation of every rule about who mattered and who didn't, who was worthy and who was worthless. Eleanor found her voice finally, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why me?" Even now, even in this moment, she couldn't quite believe it was real. Sebastian's answer was immediate, unwavering. "Because you're the only one who ever asked. Every other woman in this room tells me why they're perfect for me. You're the only one who ever questioned whether you were enough. That humility, that authenticity, that complete absence of pretense. Eleanor, you're not the woman I thought I wanted. You're the woman I actually need. Say yes. Please, say yes." And Eleanor realized in that crystalline moment that this was her crossroads, her point of no return. She could say no, could retreat back into safety and invisibility and the familiar pain of being nobody. Or she could say yes and step into a life she'd never imagined possible. Risk the conflict and criticism and certainty that people would say she didn't deserve this, didn't earn it, somehow tricked him into it. But looking into Sebastian's eyes, seeing nothing there but genuine hope and vulnerability, and that terrifying thing called love, she made her choice. Yes, Eleanor said, and then louder, clearer, letting the word carry across the ballroom to every person who'd ever dismissed her. Yes, I will marry you. Sebastian's face transformed with joy as he stood and pulled her into an embrace that was probably scandalous for such a public setting, but neither of them cared. And the room exploded, some people clapping, others whispering frantically, a few women literally fleeing in tears. But Eleanor heard none of it. She was lost in the moment, in the impossible reality that she, plain, old, invisible Eleanor, was going to be a duchess. That the man everyone wanted had chosen her. That all those years of being overlooked, all that pain and loneliness and resignation, had somehow led to this. The mystery of how life works revealed itself. Sometimes you have to walk through years of darkness before you're ready to recognize light when it finally finds you. Sometimes the happy ending doesn't come when you're young and perfect. It comes when you're older and broken and have finally stopped pretending to be anything other than exactly who you are. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's exactly when you become most worthy of being found. The morning after the proposal, Eleanor woke up expecting to find it had all been a dream, some cruel trick her desperate mind had played while she slept. But the ring on her finger was real, heavy with both literal weight and symbolic meaning she still couldn't fully process. And the gossip? Oh, the gossip was very real too. By noon, half of London was at the Hamilton door, ostensibly to offer congratulations, but really to investigate this impossible situation up close, to find the secret explanation for why the Duke would choose her. "How extraordinary," Lady Pemberton said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We had no idea you and the Duke were even acquainted." Translation: This makes no sense, and we're all trying to figure out what we missed. The codes of polite society demanded congratulations, but the underlying current was pure disbelief, mixed with barely concealed resentment. Because if Eleanor, plain, old, unremarkable Eleanor, could capture a duke, what did that say about all the better women who'd failed? Here's what nobody tells you about getting what you've always wanted. It doesn't come with the peaceful satisfaction you imagined. Instead, it comes with a whole new set of problems you never anticipated. When I finally achieved something I'd been working toward for years, something I'd convinced myself would fix everything, would prove my worth, would make me finally feel like I'd arrived. You know, what I got instead of celebration? Anxiety. Crushing, overwhelming anxiety about whether I deserved it, whether I could maintain it, whether everyone was secretly laughing at me for thinking I belonged in spaces I'd only recently been allowed to enter. And the comments, oh God, the comments, from people who couldn't just be happy for me. "Wow, I never would have expected this for you. Are you sure you're ready for this? I hope you know what you're getting into." All delivered with concerned faces and caring tones that barely masked the real message. You don't belong here, and we all know it. And eventually, everyone else will know it too. The revelation that success doesn't shield you from judgment, it actually intensifies it, hit Eleanor like a physical blow in the days following her engagement. Suddenly, everyone had opinions about her. The same people who'd ignored her for years now analyzed every aspect of her appearance, her behavior, her worthiness. She'll need considerable help preparing for her role as Duchess, one society matron declared within Eleanor's hearing. Perhaps a younger woman would have been better equipped, another mused thoughtfully. Even the compliments were barbed. How clever of the Duke to choose substance over beauty, implying she had neither. Or, what a refreshing change from the usual society belle, suggesting she was so unusual as to be aberrant. The enigma was this. She'd spent years being invisible and hating it, but now that she was visible, the scrutiny was almost worse. At least when nobody looked at you, nobody picked apart your flaws and found you wanting in 100 different ways. Margaret was perhaps the most complicated source of stress. She oscillated between vicarious pride, my sister, the Duchess, and barely concealed bewilderment about how the natural order had been so completely upended. One moment, she'd be planning the wedding with enthusiasm. The next, she'd make comments like, "Of course, you'll need to do something about your hair," or, "We must get you a proper wardrobe. We can't have you embarrassing the Duke." Each comment was a tiny trace of the old dynamic, a reminder that even now, even engaged to a Duke, Margaret still saw her as the lesser sister who needed fixing. And the nieces? Cecilia and Arabella had transformed overnight, from patronizing to obsequious, suddenly treating Eleanor with exaggerated respect that felt more insulting than their previous dismissal. "We always knew you were special, Aunt Eleanor," Cecilia lied with a straight face. "We're so happy for you," Arabella added, while her eyes told a completely different story, one of confusion, envy, and the uncomfortable realization that they'd been wrong about everything. The conspiracy theories multiplied daily, each more creative than the last. Eleanor was secretly wealthy and had hidden it for years. Eleanor had some sort of occult power over men. Eleanor had dirt on the Duke and was blackmailing him. Eleanor was pregnant, at 38, and he was being honorable. The Duke was secretly unwell and needed a nursemaid wife. Each theory was more ridiculous than the last, but they all shared a common theme. There must be some hidden explanation, some concealed reason beyond the impossible notion that he simply loved her. Because women like Eleanor didn't get fairy tale endings. That wasn't how the world worked. That wasn't how the codes of society operated. Pretty women married well. Plain women made do. Spinsters faded into the background. Those were the rules, and Eleanor's engagement had broken them so completely that people's brains were short-circuiting trying to make sense of it. Sebastian, to his credit, seemed genuinely confused by Eleanor's distress. "Why do you care what they think?" he asked one afternoon when he found her upset after a particularly brutal tea with supposed well-wishers. And Eleanor tried to explain what he, in his privileged position, couldn't quite grasp. "You've spent your entire life being wanted, being valued, being told you matter. I've spent mine being tolerated at best. When everyone around you insists something is wrong, that you don't belong, that you've somehow cheated or tricked your way into something you don't deserve, it's hard not to start believing them, especially when part of you has always believed it anyway. That's the mystery of conditional self-worth. It doesn't matter how much external validation you receive if you've internalized the message that you're fundamentally unworthy. The voices in your head speak louder than any voice from outside, and they know exactly which wounds to press on to make you doubt everything. Here's the practical truth I had to learn, and Eleanor was learning it too. When you rise above your assigned station, when you refuse to stay small and invisible and convenient, people get uncomfortable. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because your elevation forces them to confront their own limitations, their own fears, their own excuses for staying stuck. If you, flawed, imperfect, ordinary you, can achieve something extraordinary, what's stopping them? That question is too threatening, too uncomfortable, too revealing. So instead of examining themselves, they examine you. They pick you apart, find all the ways you don't measure up to their fantasy of who should be in your position, and use those perceived flaws to reassure themselves that you're the anomaly, the mistake, the glitch in the matrix. Not someone whose success suggests that maybe they could rise too if they were brave enough to try. The disappearance of your former invisible status doesn't bring peace. It brings a different kind of conflict, one fought on new terrain, but no less exhausting. Eleanor found herself in a strange liminal space, caught between two worlds and belonging fully to neither. Too elevated now to return to her former invisibility, but not yet confident enough in her new position to own it without apology. She'd catch herself apologizing for things that didn't require apology. I'm sorry for taking up your time. I'm sorry if I'm not what you expected. I'm sorry for being so much trouble. Sebastian would gently correct her each time. Eleanor, you're going to be my wife. You don't apologize for existing in spaces you belong in. You don't shrink yourself to make others comfortable. And you certainly don't let people who dismissed you for years suddenly dictate how you should feel about finally being chosen. But unlearning decades of trained invisibility, true of learned unworthiness, of reflexive self-diminishment, that's not something that happens overnight just because someone puts a ring on your finger. The external circumstances had changed dramatically, but the internal landscape was still scarred by years of rejection, still mapping roots back to the forbidden belief that this couldn't last, that she didn't deserve it, that any moment now the real Eleanor would be revealed and everything would crumble. The question that haunted her late at night was simple, but devastating. Could she learn to inhabit this new life? Or would the weight of everyone's doubt, including her own, crush this fragile, impossible happiness before it ever fully bloomed? So here we are, at the end of Eleanor's journey from invisible to undeniable, from dismissed to desired, from poor spinster aunt to duchess. But this isn't really about Eleanor, is it? It's about you. It's about the ways you've made yourself small, the times you've accepted invisibility, because fighting for visibility felt too exhausting, too risky, too likely to end in the same rejection you've experienced 1,000 times before. Eleanor's story is a mirror, and the question staring back at you from that reflection is simple but devastating. How much longer are you going to live like you don't matter? How many more years will you waste waiting for permission to take up space, to want things, to believe you deserve good things when they finally show up? The secret, Eleanor discovered, that authenticity is magnetic, that vulnerability is strength, that the right people will choose you precisely because of the things you thought made you unchosen. That's not just her truth. It's yours too, if you're brave enough to claim it. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this question. When was the last time you showed up somewhere as completely, unapologetically yourself? Not the edited version, not the performance you think people want to see, but the real, messy, complicated, occasionally broken version of you that exists beneath all the social conditioning? When was the last time you risked being seen, truly seen, instead of hiding behind the carefully constructed image of who you think you should be? Because here's what Eleanor teaches us. The years she spent invisible weren't actually about her appearance, or her age, or any of the surface-level reasons society gave for overlooking her. They were about her refusal to be authentic, her participation in her own erasure, her acceptance of the codes that said people like her didn't get to want more. And the moment she stopped performing, stopped pretending, stopped managing everyone else's comfort at the expense of her own truth, that's when everything changed. Not because she became different, but because she finally stopped trying to be anything other than exactly what she was. Here's your homework, your practical application, your chance to take this from an interesting story to actual transformation. I want you to identify one area of your life where you're still performing, still hiding, still shrinking yourself to fit into boxes other people built. Maybe it's a relationship where you can't be fully honest about what you need. Maybe it's a job where you're playing it safe instead of taking risks that could lead to growth. Maybe it's a dream you've buried because people like you don't get to achieve things like that. Whatever it is, I want you to do something terrifying this week. Stop performing. Show up as yourself. Say the thing you've been too scared to say. Ask for the thing you've been too afraid to ask for. Risk the conflict, the discomfort, the possibility of rejection. Because, here's the mystery Eleanor unlocked, you're already being rejected when you hide. You're already invisible when you perform. The only difference is that when you're authentic, you might finally connect with the people who actually see you, who choose you, who make all those years of feeling forbidden and lost suddenly make sense as necessary preparation for recognizing real connection when it finally arrives. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. But Eleanor got lucky. She met a duke who happened to value authenticity. That's not realistic for most people. And you're right. Most of us won't marry dukes. But you're also completely missing the point. Sebastian wasn't special because of his title or his wealth. He was special because he was tired of fakeness and desperate for something real. And guess what? The world is full of people exactly like that. People exhausted by performance, starving for genuine connection, looking for someone brave enough to be real so they can finally stop pretending too. But they'll never find you if you're hiding. They'll never choose you if they can't see you. And they'll never know you if you're too busy performing to let them pass the walls you've built to protect a heart that's already been hurt too many times. The revelation here isn't that you need to find a duke. It's that you need to be willing to be found, which requires you to stop hiding behind the safe invisibility you've convinced yourself is protection when it's really just another form of self-imposed prison. Let me get vulnerable with you for a moment, because I think you need to hear this. I wasted years of my life trying to be acceptable instead of being authentic. I edited myself, performed versions of myself I thought people would like, stayed small and quiet and convenient so nobody would reject me. And you know what happened? I was still lonely, still invisible, still unchosen, because nobody was choosing me. They were choosing the character I was playing, which meant I was still unseen, just in a different way. It wasn't until I said, "Forget this," and started showing up as my actual messy, complicated self that everything shifted. Did I lose some people? Absolutely. Turns out, they were never really seeing me anyway. So what did I actually lose? But the people I gained, the connections I made when I finally stopped performing. Those are real. Those matter. Those make every risk, every uncomfortable moment, every instance of being truly seen and potentially judged worth it 1,000 times over. That's what Eleanor discovered. And that's what's waiting for you on the other side of your fear, your performance, your resignation to invisibility. So here's my challenge to you. And I'm serious about this. Stop waiting. Stop preparing. Stop convincing yourself you'll be ready someday to start living authentically, to start taking up space, to start believing you deserve good things. Eleanor was 38 before she got her moment. But here's the thing. It didn't have to take that long. She could have stopped performing years earlier. She could have risked being seen long before that terrace conversation with Sebastian. But she was too scared, too convinced she'd be rejected, too invested in the narrative that people like her didn't get fairy tale endings. Don't let that be your story. Don't waste another decade being invisible when you could be undeniable. The trace of your old self-limiting beliefs doesn't have to become the roadmap for your future. You get to choose, right now, today, whether you're going to keep living like you don't matter, or start acting like someone who does. And before you say, "It's not that simple," you're right. It's not simple. It's terrifying and uncomfortable and requires you to risk the exact rejection you've been avoiding. But you know what's worse? Looking back 20 years from now and realizing you were so busy protecting yourself from potential pain that you protected yourself right out of any chance at real joy. What would happen if you stopped apologizing for existing? If you stopped shrinking to make others comfortable? If you stopped accepting the scraps of attention and affection and started demanding, no, expecting, to be seen, valued, chosen? What if the thing you think disqualifies you, your age, your appearance, your past, your failures, your whatever, is actually the thing that makes you most worthy of being found by the right people? Eleanor's flaws weren't bugs in her system. They were features that attracted exactly the person who valued authenticity over performance. Your quirks, your struggles, your complicated history, those aren't things to hide or apologize for. They're the plot points that make your story interesting, that make you real, that make you someone worth knowing instead of just another carefully curated Instagram version of a person. The disappearance of your authentic self to please people who don't actually see you isn't noble or mature or wise. It's just sad. And you deserve better than sad. You deserve real. You deserve chosen. You deserve seen. But you won't get any of that until you're willing to be those things first. One final question before I let you go. Are you going to stay in your comfortable invisibility, or are you going to risk being devastatingly, terrifyingly visible? Are you going to keep playing small, or are you going to own the space you deserve? Are you going to wait for permission, or are you going to give it to yourself? Eleanor's story doesn't end with, "and they lived happily ever after," because real life isn't a fairy tale. It ends with her choosing, every single day, to show up as herself, despite the doubt, despite the criticism, despite the voices that still whisper she doesn't deserve her good fortune. That's the real work, the daily practice of believing you matter, even when the world gives you reasons to doubt it. And if you want to learn more about living authentically, about building the courage to be seen, about transforming from invisible to undeniable, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because Eleanor's story is just the beginning, and I've got so much more to share about how you can rewrite your own narrative from resigned to remarkable. The choice is yours. Always has been. So what's it going to be?